Perfect. All right, thanks everyone. So today we're going to do two things. We're going to go through a review of online submissions that were made for what we were calling minor to moderate changes to the Canadian system of soil classification, but I would suggest there's might be a couple in there that are a bit more than moderate. And then we're also going to get an update from Richard on the work that they've been doing for the Redoximorphic soils working group. So Richard, do you want to do go first or second?
Well,
if you're still working on your deck, then you can go second.
No, actually, I'm not working on my deck. I mean, if you want, I could
go for it. You might as well.
Let's talk. Mind.
Yes.
I'm going to share my monitor here. Okay, now I'm going to be looking to my left side here because so it's not, I'm not being ignorant and not wanting to look people in the eyes. I'm just looking because that's where that's how I got my monitors organized. So, so yeah, this is a little bit of an update on where we come with the soil redoximorphic features working group. That should be redoximorphic. I did that redox anyway. Let me put this into. Oh, wait a minute! I should have done this before I shared, right? I'm sorry. Let me stop the sharing and do my split. Okay, now I escape out of that and I share. It should be giving me. Is it this one? And now, come on. Okay, does everyone see that, or do you see yourselves in the corner? I don't know if that appears or not.
Yeah,
we're good, Richard.
There. Yep.
Okay. Okay, so this is an update. Just provide context again. How to get rid of this list of people here. Okay, hide them. There we are. So this is falling out of this or proceeding from this paper that we prepared, Dan and Jim and myself, on rationalizing, modeling, and grading and characterization and classification of Canadian soils. So, I mean, one of the recommendations out of there was to establish a working group, and we've essentially done that. We've got, for better or for worse, a Teams group. Some people have been able to access that. Most have been able to drop information in there. So we've got a repository of documents in there, and there's an opportunity for people to make comments on the go in there. And just to give you an idea of where we're standing right now, this is certainly not an exclusive group by any means, but it's who we've been in, had some engagement of. There was also Kevin Keys from Maritimes, but he's got other things that are keeping him busy, so he's just sort of stepped away for a while at this point. So that gives you an idea of the group that's expressed interest in participating in this. I think we should still try in some way to encourage a little bit more representation from the extreme west and Atlantic, and specifically for some groups in Quebec. But again, it's open. This is just the first group that's been a group of people that's been talking together about this. The other main recommendation is be attentive to the evolving global understanding and applications. So, I mean, originally I mentioned in the paper and the last time around, there was this committee that was active for a certain period of time. That is sort of submitted its final report, the International Committee on Soils of Aquifer and Soil Moisture Regimes, and that was built into this document. So this is probably the most up-to-date version of the efforts that went in that particular group. There has been a new version. Some of you may have been aware of this. There has been now a new version of the World Reference Base for soils, which really reflects primarily the European philosophy and tendencies. Really, when I've glanced through there in terms of what's happened there relative to what they had in place before this most recent edition, is they've just changed the positioning of how they key out their stagnasols in terms of this particular conversation. So that in that regard, that's the major change on that side. What I have learned about, though, and this was just a consequence of my participation in the Sandy Soils conference last week, is that the soil taxonomy is now working on 2 additions to their list of orders. One is the artisols, and I think Anne's group is probably familiar with that. I just happened to get a recent copy of that from last week, and I sent it to her, and she can take a look at that. But the other is the aquasols. They want to create an order called aquasols. And this is coming out of deliberations of another committee, which is the International Committee for Subaqueous and Aquic Soils. And you can see who the membership at this time has been. And I guess at their National Cooperative Soil Survey Conference 2 years ago or so, they took a vote for considering the addition of this kind of an order, what they're calling now an aquasol order. And they voted 80% to proceed with this change. And just in the documentation, I found some interesting tidbits of information, and I've always wondered about this, and perhaps some of you have as well, why they don't have some kind of order like this. And apparently it was Guy Smith that rationalized, it says here, wet soils should be at the suborder level, because if the soils were drained, they would behave much like their better drained counterparts on the landscape. And that was, I guess, because at that time, agriculture was king, and drainage of wetlands to get agricultural soils was the way to go. And so we weren't really worried, or we, in royal sense, worried about trying to deal with these types of soils at a higher categorical level. But I think it does even contain some snippets that I'm going to come back to a little bit later. This whole notion, behave much like their better drained counterparts. And I know we also drain soils, right? So this isn't foreign. And then they finished off in this historical review saying, or rationalizing, this suggests that if draining wasn't an option, Guy Smith would have placed the wet soils at the order level. So that, I guess, we come around the wheel, right? And that's the part of their argument for saying we need to have this kind of an order. So yeah, they've moved ahead with that, and the most recent information in terms of how they visualize this being structured, I've thrown it up here. This is what how it would fit into their keys. So I guess the discussion must be going that the artisols are going to be keyed out first, and whether that's going to be coherent with how it's going to be handled here in Canada, followed by the jelly sols, histosols. Now, recognizing they do not have leptosols, and the effort that Jim has been leading to create the leptosol order, there's still some debate, I guess, where exactly our leptosols would fit in that. But immediately after their histosols then is where they're proposing throwing in the aquasols. And they've got this basic definition for keying out the aquasols. You can see that there's a variety of potential options here. One is related to the presence of depletion or concentration features, what we would call modeling in our soils, or the presence of reducing conditions based on aqua conditions that one can determine using the Dipradil test, or where there's inundation for at least 21 hours per day, every day of the year. And I had a conversation with Jim this morning. We're thinking that's probably in some tidal areas where you're at the low end of, or the low point of the tidal area. So that comes into play there, or have their aquatic conditions. So that's what they're visualizing in terms of coming up with an order that would come back to something around the lines that we have with our glycols. And then they visualize what 8 suborders, and they've got some very interesting names there: the Wasex, the Perax, the Leptax, Vertax, Humax, Samax. I don't know if that's Arjax or Argax. I don't know how they're going to pronounce that. And then the Orthax. So the document that I've received is a lot more comprehensive this, but I thought I'd just throw up this level just to give you an idea of their line of thought and their intentions in the US. I can pause for a moment if there's any. I mean, don't query me as if I'm fully steeped in the nuances of this at this moment. I'm just realizing this is happening. So okay, I'll come back to this actually toward the end. So we've had an initial group meeting on the 14th, and this was really more just a general get to know what each of us our philosophies are in this, and try to come up with some discussion amongst the points that were identified in the paper in terms of their potential for further development or attention. So looking at those items, then just as a reminder, we went through a discussion on all of these items. So on the issue of revision, clarification of the conceptual definitions of some of the terminologies that we're using: modeling, glade, glycol. What's reduction? There's a variety of documentations out there of various vintages. I think, as in my personal opinion, and perhaps more would agree, that if these are going to be used somehow within the taxonomic system, there's got to be some clear glossary associated with that, so people aren't bringing their own understanding of these terms to the interpretations. Standardization of criteria for the description of redoximorphic features. Again, I don't think this is a huge issue, because you go through the criteria that's used, and the manual is developed out west. I know it's quite, for the most part, coherent with what we're using. We've got in the book here in Ontario, and if you look in some other documents. But I think, again, across the board, whether we're looking at some guidelines for determining soil drainage or moisture regime in a particular province, or if it's at the level of the taxonomic system, there should be some kind of standardization of what we are calling these things, and the semi-quantitative descriptions of them. A review of the G and the GJ designations, and I threw in their usage. So how do we use them? On one hand, we have definitions for these in the list of horizon designations, but then when you go into the keys, sometimes, and you're working through at the order or grade group level, subgroup level, there's ancillary definition in there. Sometimes it's quite coherent with what we see in terms of the definition of a horizon. Other times there's slight nuance differences, and so alignment of these definitions and linkages into the key. That's really where that point is going to. Rationalization and definitions and application of glycolic and glade subgroups. So, as I'll be throwing up a little bit later, we've got, again, when you go from one part of the key to the other, there may be variations, and because you're finding it in the key level where things are being keyed out to a glycolic subgroup or a glade subgroup. Is it being consistently applied from one throughout the entire system? And one item that we identified, and I suppose is still an issue for discussion moving forward, is within the vertisols we have both glycolic and glade, but we don't have in podsols. I'm going to address that more specifically later. And really, at this point, they're being utilized to create, and in the taxonomy we have formal definition, and it's in the key listed separately as unique subgroups. There was the discussion in the work that Jim put forward regarding the leptosols, whether we would move back to the utilization of a subgroup modifier, and whether that would also be applicable to the notion of the application of the terms of glycolic and glade at the subgroup level. Because if, again, you look through the key, and in a lot of cases, you've got this duality. First, is it blah, blah, blah glade version of this? And if it's not, then it's just a regular version of that. And so you've got this duality running through the entire system. And is this really the most efficient way to do it? Or we just say, okay, glycolic means this. If you see it in the profile, it's handled as a subgroup modifier, just modify the subgroup. So the discussion around that. Thinking about that there are other nuances in terms of when it comes to the taxonomy, the glycolic soils. I know there's the discussion that led into the early 70s of whether we have groundwater versus surface water glade soils of pseudoglade, and they do have this in both the world reference base, the stagnosols versus the glycols, and in the soil taxonomy, the epi, and there's an anthracite, I think, forms. And so is there argument, what would that look like for reflecting on some of these the capacity to further distinguish amongst these glide soils, glycolic soils, perhaps using phases at the family level? And what would that look like? There's a lot of options that are available that have been presented in WRB and in the soil taxonomy and probably other systems. So I mean, just take a look at some of those, and maybe some of them are worthwhile adapting. Maybe there are some that we'd like to develop on our own. And then finally, the last number on that list is rationalization of how these concepts are handled in the Canadian system of soil classification, not CSSS, sorry, that's supposed to be C at the end, and the various frameworks that exist across the country in different provinces for defining drainage and moisture regimes. Should there be some kind of more clear coherence between the two systems or not? And if that's the case, how do you even broach that? Because I recognize here in Ontario our definitions of series have been linked classically to the soil drainage class, and there's that challenge that sometimes the soil drainage class and the taxonomic class might not align as one sees. And then certainly the changing the taxonomic system is not so problematic from a provincial policy perspective, but sometimes changing the drainage class could be very complicated land use policy that exists provincially. So I know it's not a trivial matter. Why is this not advancing now? Okay. Some other thoughts that have come to my mind over in subsequent weeks, and especially coming out of some of these other documents that I've looked at, and so I'm just throwing them out at this moment for the entire group, but eventually hopefully the working group will also be looking at them. On one hand, there's with the introduction of this, and I mentioned it earlier, the so-called aquasols. They've chosen, if you look at the current soil taxonomy structure in terms of the order of precedence of orders, they're supposedly going to be putting their artisols up front, and then they'll follow in with their jelly sols and histosols. But they've had to make a decision. Obviously, they didn't have it there. So where are they looking at actually throwing their soils, their aquasols, and they've decided that it's going to go or proposing that it's going to go between the histosols and their spotosols. That's a little bit different from where we've had ours placed. We've got the cryosols, the organic, and again, exactly where the anthroposols and the leptosols are going to go. That's a discussion perhaps a little bit outside the scope of this moment. But then we follow up with our vertisols and podzolic soils, and then come in our glycolic soils. And as a consequence, at least within the vertisolic order, we have provisions for the possibility of the expression of features that would otherwise throw it in the glycolic soil, which is typically what the prominent models. So we've got both a glycolic subgroup and a glade subgroup for the vertisols. It doesn't exist for the podzolic soils, but I believe that there is glycolic and glade. No, I think it's just glycolic at in the cryosolic order. There's no provision for glade subgroup in the cryosolic order. Just glycolic. And organic, well, it's I suppose a moot point for the most part. So I think this is also something for us to reflect upon at the higher level. They are being forced in the US in the soil taxonomy to approach it front on, because they've got to decide where is it going to go, and they're tending toward throwing it in there. Are we satisfied? That's just a question I'm throwing out. Are we satisfied with the placement of where we've got the glycols placed? Certainly, if it was to be keyed out at a higher level, the notion of glycolic might potentially be able to take on a different implication. And that's where I'm at this point. So again, the chrysolic order, we've got glycolic, applicable vertisol, glycol, glade, only podzolic glade, and then glycol. Following that, the solenoids, the trinosem, the luvasolic, renosolic, regosolic, they've only got glade, because supposedly if they've got such an advanced stage of the redoximorphism, it's a glycol, it would be out above. The leptosols is being proposed that it would have both a glycolic and glade subgroup, and then the anthroposols, at least to my understanding, and some of the other group are there, that there's a tendency to move away from those two terms, and I think the operative phrasing in there is that modeling and glaying are not necessarily diagnostic in the anthropogenic disturbed environment, as they may be legacies of the undisturbed soil. And that's where I'd like to pick up on. And so this is sort of where I'd like to finish off and just get some reaction to it. The notion of active versus relic redoximorphism. This was one of the questions David Lindbo proposed to the group last week. I mean, what is relic, a relic feature in the soil? Certainly, if you just look at it in a strict sense, modeling indicates that redoximorphism has been active at some point during the development of the soil and that point in the landscape. And that's a given. We've got that redistribution was due to chemical reduction and remobilization and precipitation. So that modeling indicates at some point along the way, but it's not just because we see that doesn't mean that that point in the landscape is right now experiencing active redoximorphism, redox, oxidation, reduction, alternation. You have to confirm that. You really need to confirm it. One of the options available to us now is the Dipperdill test paper. If you think it's reduced, you can stick the paper on and say yes or no. I mean, there may be other clues. You've got a high groundwater table, and fine, you've got a clue. But simply saying, because you've got modeling without anything else, that this is reflecting some kind of active process is going one step too far. I think it's an assumption too far. Yes, it has happened, but it's just not saying that it's happening. Is it important for us when we're looking at these soils and our glycols and how we're handling it in the other orders to distinguish between relic and active? Is it important for us to know that hydromorphism is actively taking place at that point of the landscape versus it has sometime in the past, but it isn't anymore? That brings us to for me, it brings me to the question of what does the term glade imply? G-L-E-D. Is it the past tense? Could we potentially, and again, that would potentially involve rethinking where, how we're handling these notions and potentially where glycols are keynote, not necessarily though. Do we potentially restrict the usage of the glycolic subgroup term to where we have evidence of active redoximorphism? And if that can't be confirmed, then we would default to a glade subgroup, regardless of the contrast of the color modeling. It's whether or not we have glaying, active glaying, some indicator, whether we've got a groundwater table there, we've got or we've got some Dipperdill paper test. If that is saying that we observed and we know that at least some point during the year, that point in the landscape, some part of the profile is undergoing chemical reduction, then we could say, okay, that's glycolic. If we can't, but we know it's clearly happened in the past because the modeling is there, glade. That sort of where I'd like to pause in my talk and maybe hear from you people what your orientations are.
Can you go back?
Oh,
Oh, very nice. Is that your farm?
yeah. How far back do you want me to go?
Just that last slide you're on. Like the use of the.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, I guess what's one of the issues here, of course, is the way that the terminology is used today with what you're proposing here, potentially as glycolic being, evidence of active redoximorphism versus glade truly being the past tense, so it's something that's happened in the past.
Or we don't know for sure that it's happening, actively happening.
Right. So right now, the use of the term glycolic is used for those soils that key out above the clay soils, but that have characteristics of the clay soils. And so we use the term glycolic. Whereas glade, they don't meet the requirements of the glycolic. And the reason I think they added it is because those soils key out ahead of the clay soils. The exception, of course, is the podzolic soils. For some reason, they only have a glade subgroup. They don't have the glycolic subgroup. And so I think that was just short-sighted view of what the clay soils look like. But and they probably should have had a glycolic group for the podzels. So you'd have glycolic podzels and glade podzels, because I've seen podzolic soils that have, prominent modeling above 50 centimeters. They do form in very wet environments. That does happen. And so that's something that can get missed, or at least is only classified as a glade podzels, but should probably be called a glycolic podzol. So I'm just looking at this, also thinking about, well, then that, if we change the way that we use these terms, then there's going to be a fundamental change in the taxonomy in general. If we're saying glycolic is now, because to me, then that means, okay, well, the glycolic is now, all of the glycols in Southern Ontario need to be called something different. They are no longer glycols because they are all tile drained. They no longer have an influence of a water table that's sufficient to drive those processes anymore. They're all becoming glade barunosols essentially. And so what are your thoughts on that, Richard, in terms of,
Well,
these anthropogenic effects on water tables that are now, so if we were to change to use glade as in the past and not glycolic, like the glaying process is no longer active in those agricultural soils with tile drainage. And so then do they become glade something? Glade glycols?
So I think it comes back to that point that I raised right here. Is it important to distinguish between relic and active redoximorphism? What are we trying to do? Because I mean, just because it's a more striking expression of the coloration, we've got the prominent models, so it's glycolic, versus, well, they didn't make it to prominent, so, well, okay, unfortunately, it's going to be glade. Is that really, or is it something that is the issue of my knee jerk is what's probably more important is whether or not it's relic or active redoximorphism, as opposed to how exuberant is the coloration in the profile. That may be reflective of active. I won't deny that. But is simply the coloration, is it not more critical from a management perspective, from an ecosystem function perspective, that we know that this point in the landscape does undergo redox?
But I think that also speaks, Richard, to me, that speaks to the disconnect between soil drainage and soil classification, because I can have a glycol, and I can tell you that glycol, so it can be classified as an orthocumic glycol, and I can tell you that it's moderately well drained, and that's perfectly acceptable. There's no direct connection between drainage class and soil taxonomy, and so that's how I would deal with that. Imperfect, moderately well drained glycols, they exist. There's no direct connection between drainage and taxonomy, and I know you pointed to that in one of your previous slides. Do we need to have a link between taxonomy and drainage class? And I'm not sure that we do, but it certainly leads to problems.
Well, I think we've got to have some kind of way to go from one to the other, because you do have that. Okay, well, I mean, we could bear down, but we do know that there are situations where it's not intuitive what the link is between the taxonomic classification and the drainage class. And I know that's not a trivial matter. I admit that. I'm here at this level here in terms of what meaning we throw behind these two terms, vis-a-vis the issue of whether it's important for us to be distinguishing from a scenario where the soil in that point in the landscape is subject to oxidation reduction as part of one of the main pedogenic processes, ongoing pedogenic processes, or whether for whatever reason that isn't really happening anymore, and it's just the features have not been obliterated.
Chi, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I read your paper there. It was a very well done paper there, and congratulations for that. Very solid proposal there. On this feature about glycolic versus glide, I'm kind of bit in favor of taxonomic approach rather than just look at active or relic features. What happened is one of the reasons for classification is for resource inventory purposes, as well as for phylogenetic process description, discussion, and all that. Not a wetland. When sometimes people build a road there, it could change their kind of drainage characterization, and then the feature, if we look at active versus relic, then are you going to go back there and say, well, that soil previously classified as this and that, now just because somebody built a road here and disrupt its drainage and condition there, or the moisture regime, and now we're going to go back there and change their classification. You know, those seem to be a bit harder to really connect and addressing these kind of changes. And so I kind of I'm kind of in favor of saying what the glycolic there to be the feature that meets the glycolic soil order there, and glide be used to describe the intergrade as something as a subgroup feature of other order. Yeah, that's just my perspective.
So when I look at our current definition for keying out the glycolic order, it says other soils that are saturated with water and under reducing conditions, either continuously or during some period of the year, as indicated by direct measurements of the water table and the oxidation reduction status, or by any of the following morphological features. And that's where all of these colorations come in.
Yeah.
My point down here was linking this usage. That's for a glycolic, to go to the glycolic order. And remember to apply the term glycolic above the glycolic order. It has to meet the criteria of the glycolic soil, but that there was another soil feature that took precedence, and so it doesn't get that far down. So I'm really, what's being proposed here really isn't a fundamental shift in that concept, because glycolic is under reducing conditions either. So this is not relic anymore. This is really defining active. Our definition of glycolic order really brings into it the notion that it is active. The confusing item is where the prominent modeling is brought in. Because just to say that it doesn't have prominent modeling, for example, B, chromas 2 or less, hues of on PED surfaces or in the matrix are like accompanied by prominent modeling. Is the modeling so critical, or is it the fact that it is actually chemically reduced? If this is all in linked to the notion of the redoximorphic features, the modeling that's there, how we're linking that to our conceptualization of these either being a relic or active, and the application of the term glycolic and glide. Because glide, if it's not glycolic, that means it's not active, and so it falls down into a subgroup level of another. So where you've got the active reducing conditions, it's going into the glade soil, glycolic soil order, sorry. I don't see this really as being fundamentally in conflict with the concepts that are in there. It's really approaching the whole issue of the modeling and having, therefore, a much clearer linkage between what do we mean by glycolic and linking that to the active notion versus glade, which is relic.
Right. And how would you deal with that within the glycolic order then? For
Well, I mean,
glycols with relic features. So the majority of our drained soils in Ontario, for example, are
well,
all drained, but they still have prominent models. So they still meet the criteria of the glycolic order.
no, they don't.
So you
Because
would
if you
remove
read,
that.
that means we'd change fundamentally what is meant by glycolic order. Those soils are being at this moment erroneously classified as glycol because our system says are saturated with water and under reducing conditions, either continuously or during some period of the year. So, I mean, if the drainage isn't totally effective and you do get some period of reduction, you just reduce that period, may still fall in there because we haven't actually got any number of days that are required there. But if you do have a scenario where you've completely drained the soil and it's not experiencing at any point anymore saturation and reduction, then it's really not a glycol anymore, according to the first line of the definition of the glycolic order.
Yeah, but if you go on page 82, it says that glycolic soils are associated with a number of different moisture regimes that may change during genesis. They commonly have paraquic or aquic regimes, but some have aqueous regimes, and others are now rarely, if ever, saturated with water. So,
okay, so there we go again. Do we?
Yeah.
That's the fundamental question I'm asking. Is it the redoximorphic chemistry that is reflected in the redoximorphism that's critical for us? Or is it just the fact that we've got this pretty collection of models? Because if you didn't have the modeling, you wouldn't even consider it.
Right. We're going to go, we'll move on to Jim's question / comment, please.
I don't see anybody. I'm just looking at my screen here, so I don't have any.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, we've got Jim and Katrina after.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as Richard alluded to, we had a bit of a discussion this morning on some of these things. One of the things that this, at least in my mind, clears up is that, okay, if we differentiate active versus relic, one of the problems we had with the, not problems, but one of the things we're grappling with the anthroposolic order, and in a lot of cases, in our case, soils that have been tile drained, all of these soils have been affected by anthropogenic activity, whether it be tile drainage, whether it be just cultivation. So by doing this, okay, in terms of, I know we have a huge, in southwestern Ontario, we have a huge area there, which is all typically, they're all classified as glycols now. If the entire area is tile drained, and it is pretty much for all intents and purposes, and most of these soils now, if they were glycols, they couldn't be cultivated the way they are. Point being that, yes, okay, if we did go this route, a lot of those soils would now be classified as something other than a glycol. And yes, it would be a large group, but I think it also gets around the fact that, okay, we're dealing with a system now in a lot of cases, both in the West and here, where anthropogenic influences are actually influencing our soil. Remember, we're actually classifying the soil as we see it at the time we're actually digging the pit and looking at it.
That's right.
So yes, back in the day, yes, it would have been a glycol. Maybe today it's a glybrunosol. But that is what it is if we go by that definition. So it's not really a question, it's just a comment.
Thanks, Jim.
And
But
that,
I was going to say, to play devil's advocate, then you'd have to have knowledge of whether that field is tile drained or you're digging in a very dry year.
Well, no. If you go by Richard's definition, okay, Richard's use of glycolic, okay, we would have to have some other evidence that that particular soil that you're looking at is still actively being influenced by the water table. So it would have to have positive reaction with Dipperdale, or the water table's high enough that, yep, it's wet. So really that, I suppose it really takes modeling sort of out of the picture a little bit.
Yes. From the standpoint of a glycolic order or a glycolic subgroup, the modeling, clearly that's there because that it experienced redoximorphism at some period. So at minimum, it's a glade soil. If you can come up with some other justification in terms of water table or a direct measurement that I was out there when I was out there, because we're describing the soil as we see it at that moment. And if I go out there with my test strip and it's a little bit gray down there and I put my test strip on and it's chemically reduced, well, I'm not inferring anything from the modeling anymore. I've got a direct measure. And it's no different really than when you see a whitish horizon and you think, oh, there must be some carbonates there. You don't leave it at that. You've got to drop your acid on it and confirm that it's carbonates. It's the same thing. You see some dull coloration in this horizon, and your gut reaction as well. It must be indicating redox conditions. There's no question, or there's no necessity to be questioning that anymore. Just as easily you can have acid to drop on, you can get a Dipperdale test paper and stick it on, and you can confirm yes or no. So it's really just really moving to solidify what is already written in our first line of our definition of glycolic soils, that there has to be some evidence that this is actually happening. And simply the modeling is not adequate. It's usually an indicator that it probably has happened and it may be happening, but it's not indicating that is actually happening. It's the modeling, I suppose, that's got me most because we use prominent modeling versus distinct or faint. Distinct or faint, okay, it's got to be just glade. Prominent, it's glycolic. Oh.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go to Katrina was next, and then Brandon after.
Hey, yeah, I just just wanted to comment from an Alberta perspective, because I'm a pedologist, but also a wetland practitioner, and Alberta we've got our own wetland policy that is great, but it's still being expanded and growing. And this is definitely something that is a bit of a sticking point, because a lot of the people that work for Alberta Environment do not understand soil and do not understand that exactly how pedology works or drained soils work. So we're having a lot of issues with this. So I do really love that you're trying to update the CSSC, because this is kind of definitely a gray area. And then in our wetland policy, it's also a gray area. And so it's creating a lot of issues. So from that perspective, I really love this in the discussion. And I agree that models are very, very problematic, especially for altered soils. A lot of our wetlands have been, historically either filled in or drained or anthropogenically altered. And so it's really tough, because according to the modeling, it still is supposed to be classified as a wetland.
Okay, thanks, Katrina. Brandon.
Thanks, and Richard. I guess from sort of like a soil mapping standpoint, and kind of thinking about the existing state of our soil information systems, like what do you view as a viable pathway towards kind of correcting existing soil databases if we're going to make a change like this? Like how do we correct it? I don't really know.
Well, it boils down to the fact that did these people actually correctly designate something as a glycolic order or glycolic subgroup? And if it was just based on prominent models, that's where the question comes in. Because if it was faint or distinct models, it probably wouldn't have been stuck into a glycolic order, or well, maybe they might have, but
Well, that would depend on, it would depend on the,
Yes.
on the glaying, right? Because you can have faint models, but you can have a very glayed soil, and that makes that right now makes it a glaze sol. But yeah, I think, I think Brandon, where Brandon's coming from is, yeah, you know, the existing databases, if we were to make this change, how then do we rationalize those changes within the existing databases? So which glazols do we change to not being glazols now? So that's certainly a challenge in kind of in reflecting these changes in prior data that's been collected, right?
But okay, yeah, there's a variety of nuances. I understand that.
Mhm.
As it stands though, and as you pointed out, when I read the part of the key and you read some two paragraphs out of the chapter on glycols, we've got internal inconsistencies with regard to that in the current documentation, which people use, that's the guides. And but then just the fundamental notion of the glycolic order, and unless we take that leading sentence that under reducing conditions, either continuously or during some period of the year, indicated by measurements of water table or redox status. There's no, what I'm trying to say is there's not necessarily, it's not necessarily the truth that by having this level of modeling that you're seeing, that you are having this condition of under reducing conditions, either continuously or during some period of the year. That's the nuance that I'm throwing in there. And if then you do remove that, then it really is effectively assigning the concept of glycolic to a scenario, which it really should be in terms of our definition of active redoximorphism. And if it's not actively redoximorphic, then not being active means it's relic. And we've been throwing glade in that. So is that essentially what we're saying? In summary, glade refers to a scenario relic. I can't prove that it's active. It's not active. And glycolic is, yes, I have some kind of evidence that I can say that that's actively happening at the time when I was out doing my survey.
Okay, Chantel, please.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, thanks for bringing up this conversation again. And thinking about, at least from the Saskatchewan, again, wetland perspective in the prairies, trying to figure out whether or not it's currently active is super difficult because it depends for us on the year, how much snow we have in the spring, things like that. If we're going to see these active features when we go out in the fall, per se, so 5 months after the water had first ponded in the wetlands. So it's just keeping that in mind. I'm having my own back and forth of trying to figure out how to best consider those. And then once we drain them, again, we're seeing a lot of surface drainage more than tile drainage here. So how we can incorporate that into this classification. And one other thing I'll add, just based on like the relic and active, some work I did with like Jacob Berkowitz down in the States and the hydric soils folks working on that. A lot of their relic features that they're talking about, we're talking more about like the nodules and concentrations.
Sure.
Whereas like their active features were more these soft masses that like we'd consider like these models that you can like easily crush in your fingers. And they did a lot of distinction whether or not it's like in a pore lining or if it's on the matrix, and doing kind of if the matrix is depleted or things like that. I think might be help, at least for Saskatchewan, I've seen in our work that we're doing, be able to help kind of tease away these nuances. But it is something that I think trying to get across these different drainage systems and is going to be really tricky for sure. So,
well, again, Chantel, you're bringing in the whole depletion and concentration concepts, which I think are much more precise than the way we've been handling it. And yes, I fully understand the notion of nodules versus what you're calling soft nodules. But so you're saying that in the Saskatchewan framework, you can't be sure all the time. And so then what are we kidding ourselves? And I'm not directing that specifically at you or the group there. I'm saying just generically, are we kidding ourselves then that we're worried about this notion that it is under reducing conditions? Or are we just, it's got this kind of redoximorphic expression in terms of the the coloration, the modeling, and if it passes a certain threshold in terms of that the modeling of coloration, the depletion features, the concentration features, then it goes into one category. If the degree of development of that coloration is inadequate, then it goes into the other category. Which is it? Can we rationalize these two concepts? That is just a degree of expression of the modeled coloration, with the expectation that we have said that we're keying those things out because supposedly they at some period still are undergoing reducing conditions. That's the definitions we have in the manual. I'm not creating this dilemma that exists.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think for us, like where we've surveyed kind of across the province for wetland soils, not to make it more complicated, but soil texture was the biggest thing of whether we're not seeing that prominence in the coloration of our redoximorphic features. So if we got a sandier texture versus a really heavy clay, that prominence we see really skews depending on our soil texture as well. And I know that is also included in the hydric soil indicators manual that they've got running in the States. So maybe that's something worth considering.
And this is why I pushed the Dipper-Dill test paper. It's a way of measuring directly whether or not you've got chemical reduction down to the level of Fe2.
And I guess our concern with that is the biggest thing is it would depend when we're going out in the year. If I'm able to go out in the spring every year, and then I would be really confident in it. But if I'm going out in October, November, before the snow falls and it's quite dry, it's a matter of, will we see that same result, even of course, like across a year.
So you're using other nuances of the soil, of the landscape, to suggest that is still likely an operational process.
Yeah. And
because you're thinking there's a groundwater table there.
Exactly.
You're not relying in the fact that you've got some kind of modeling or potentially not having modeling could be a peripheral decision making. And you've said it yourself, the level of confidence you have is lower because you haven't confirmed it.
Richard, did we share that the US, that there was a paper, wasn't there, on the Dipper-Dill and
it's in the collection that's there.
Okay, it's in the collection that's there on the Google Drive. Okay, I just want to make sure.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. If you don't actually measure it and you don't have some indication of a groundwater table, you just think, well, at some point in the year, this should be like this. That is a judgment call.
And for us, we've been really focusing on the matrix depletion to double check, especially for some of these really ephemeral wetlands that might have water in them for a month, but they're still showing signs that they're acting like a wetland soil. Is what we've really been focusing on. So going beyond just the models, but also looking really in depth at the matrix as well.
So we're at halftime, but we'll go. We've got one more comment, one more hand up. So Rong Wei, if you would like to unmute and provide your comment or question for Richard, and then we will move to our second item.
Yeah, I just have two issues, not issues, first reach the presentation today, and one is just like the idea, what Dan said, when soil have a tile drainage, soil soil drainage changed. What we had before in the Manitoba's soil survey, if so poorly soil drained soil, we usually classify that as a glycol, and if a tile drainage practiced over there, and because the soil drainage improved, some kind of the soil we classified as imperfect drained, because we went to the field and checked the characteristic of the soil profile. They should be classified as a glide subgroups, not the glycol. That's one point. Another point is for some of the modeling, and poorly drained soil or glycol, sometimes it's very hard to define in the low organic matter soil, for example, fan sand and loamy fan sand. In Manitoba, we have lots of these like calcium deposit with fan sand and loamy fan sand. Of course, there are some of the the redoxism feature over there, but the modeling and the dark color is not permanent as high organic matter content soil like loam or clay loam. So in this case, if the soil drainage is very, very poor, we still even have no permanent modeling and glide color, we still classify that soil as clay soil, not imperfect in the soil. Yeah.
Okay, so that's one thing I'm saying, Emma. We don't have to rely simply on the degree of development of mottled coloration. We have test strips, just like we don't have to assume just because we got some white powderish material in the profile that it's carbonate. You can drop acid on it and determine it. We have a test strip which can clearly indicate yes or no at the point of time when I'm looking at this, regardless of whether there's modeling or not, it's chemically reduced. I think that question has a resolution. We just have to popularize the use of the test paper to confirm or not. The tile drainage, I've thought about this, and yes, Jim raised this point. Everybody raises this point. Well, to say that because you've tile drained it, it suddenly is relic. And tile drainage is not necessarily 100% effective, so it still may be there. Well, whereas the notion of bringing in the capacity to have phases, redoximorphic phases. Why can't we have a tile drained phase criteria? So it's a glycol. Like you shut down the tile drainage, you plug it, it's going to be going through that saturation, and it's likely it's going to start the anaerobic conditions are going to start kicking in and will become chemically reduced. Iron's going to be reduced. It's probably going to happen if the tile drains got plugged up. So it's not like that we've uplifted this landscape and there's never going to be a groundwater table anymore. So why don't we simply admit, yes, there's still glycols, whatever, but it's tile drained. So this becomes part of the just as we would steeply sloping, stony. The phase that we've got is a tile drained phase of whatever glycolic soil.
Yeah, that if the only put the tile drain over there for about a couple of years or so, of course that's the soil is still the glycol because the water table and some of the horizon characteristics are still over there. If the tile drain put on there for over 10 years, for example, that's some of the soil profile of course that changed over there.
But you're doing this, you're using this system at a point in time, you're going out and you're describing the soil and you're classifying the soil. If you're saying, well, something can happen over 10 years, well, then you've got to go back and make the description and the reclassification at that point in time, because everything here is based on a point in time and what you actually observe in the field. So if you're observing that it's a tile drained soil and then simply, yeah, it's tile drained. Tile drain phase of this soil.
Yeah, because some of the producers they complain that because they have put it on the tile drainage over there and their all the drainage improved and their soil should be classified for some reason, and that's why we have to go back to the field and to have a look, have a survey over there, or have dig a hole to observe the horizon over there. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Well, Richard, did you get more than you asked for?
That's sort of what I anticipated.
Perfect. Yeah, I think so. And I think, Richard, I think there's a lot of, this is going to be, I think, a lot of work I think to get through these concepts and to get these changes in there. And I think one of the big hurdles maybe is even identifying and flagging all of the inconsistencies between, for example, the key and chapter 7 on the glycolic order, because there are inconsistencies between, because you were reading from the key that, you know, these things have to be present, things like a water table, seasonally. And then when you read the slightly different text in chapter 7, it says that those things may or may not be there. And so certainly there's certainly some inconsistencies I think that we need to deal with, and it's not only with the glycolic order. There are other things in the key versus the chapters where there's some inconsistencies. And if you rely only on the key, you're not getting the full picture. And if you rely only on the chapter, you're maybe not getting the whole picture. So, and I think that's apparent in some of the things we're going to look at in this next
But the
grouping of
thing
issues.
Methodology has evolved. Our concepts, our understanding of things have evolved. We've got to be able to come up. It's like you've got an older house, and if you want to put a layer of paint on or whatever, or fix the drywall, you can do that. But if you start tinkering around with the electrical system, you start tinkering around with the plumbing, right away the municipality comes in and says, you got to bring this entire thing up to code. So yeah, I think there's inconsistencies in there, but it isn't, I don't think, in my opinion, it's not good enough just to go in and try to equal out the inconsistency. There's got to be some kind of step back, think about what we're really wanting to, where we're really wanting to go, because we're doing at the level where we've got to upgrade the electrical system. And so do we want to bring it up to the level that is going to put us at the cutting edge and hopefully avoid any issues in the near future? That's my...
Yeah, I guess my comment was more geared towards identifying and making sure that those inconsistencies don't persist in what we produce next. So these ones are maybe these issues are going to be a little bit faster, I think. I'm just going to go through the list. I had sent this out, and hopefully people have had a chance to review some of these and maybe pick the ones that they want to that they may want to have additional discussion on. But some of these are pretty straightforward, and I think we'll try to fly through them. And then if we feel some of them need more discussion, if we have time, we'll discuss today, and if not, we'll do so at a later time. So I'll just start going through them, and I think we'll see that a lot of them are pretty quick. So these were all of the minor changes that were submitted. Some of them are just as minor as the first one, which I've highlighted green because I would just assume that nobody's going to argue that we should write the word soil correctly. And so I'll just go through them, and I'll flag these as green if there's no one opposed to the change that's being proposed, and if there is, then we'll just kind of leave them blank, and we can circle back. So Jim submitted this for page 121, and I will go to page 121. Oh, past 121. Here we go. Very simple change. The codes that are put here at the end for the verdict solonetzic soils are not done incorrectly. So this is a brown verdict solonet, so the V should be on the other side of the period. So that's the pretty straightforward change, I think. I don't think we need to debate that one. This is just an error in the book. And so I will blow past that one. So within each chapter discussing each of the soil orders, it would be highly useful and more intuitive if the listing of the soil order chapters, the grade groups and subgroups within each chapter were to follow the same order that are there listed in the key. So if we have a logical sequence for keying out soils in our taxonomic system, and so why would we not respect that same order in the chapters? And so that goes in terms of, so right now you'll note that the chapters are organized alphabetically, and so this proposed change would say we're going to follow the same order as the key to soil taxonomy, or just to the Canadian system of soil classification, where we would reorganize all of the chapters to follow the key. And then the other thing would be within, so I'm just gonna go back to the glycols, because, you know, despite the fact that the glycols are likely to change, the one thing they did in the glycols is, for some reason, I'm not sure why, but in this case, they said the grade groups and subgroups are arranged in the order in which they are keyed out. So we did it for one of the chapters. We put the great groups and subgroups in the order in which they key out, but for the majority of them, we haven't. And so that is a proposed change. So to reorganize the chapters and then to reorganize the items within the chapters to follow the key. And I saw Richard had his hand up. Is there a comment, Richard?
You muted, Richard.
So on one hand, one knee jerks positively and the other jerks negatively. If in the absence of a hyperlink, to get some idea of what's following what, you've got to have this taxonomic system completely, and that's all you think about all day long. So not alphabetical. We know what comes after A, what comes after B, what comes after C. I think if you're actually using a paper version of this, perhaps the fastest way is still alphabetical. There could be something on the edges to help find the tabs quicker. But in a document that's purely electronic, if these things are all hyperlinked, if the description then it makes no difference, because it really doesn't follow anything. It's just a page in the entire directory that it's associated with. So this is really an issue that I think on a printed document becomes a challenge. That's why I'm saying I don't know which way my knee jerk is working.
Okay. And any other comments on reorganizing things in the book? One thing is that we will not be producing a print copy. Of course, those that choose to print will have a print copy, but we'll just be producing an electronic copy, which I would assume if you're going through the key, you click on something, it would take you to that specific page. I guess the other thing I would point out is that the key does have page references.
Or not actually go to that page, actually just open another window when you click on the hyperlink. If it's a description, if it would open just another window that you could, so that you wouldn't completely lose your space.
All right, no conclusively against, no conclusively for. So let's move on. We'll leave that one white for now. Okay, Jim proposed this, and I think I agree with Jim. I had brought this up at one of our pedology committee meetings previously at the CSSS. References to the manual that refer to Day 1983, which is the manual for describing soils in the field, should be updated and expanded so that all relevant information is in the document. So that refers to, I believe it's chapter 17, which is the descriptions. I will get there eventually. Oh, bandwidth is not good today, apparently. So series, phases, correlation. Well, that chapter needs a redo. 17 here. So terminology for describing soils. And so we can see here that, we talk about, for example, landform and relief. See section 8B in the manual. I think we should put the manual in brackets at the very least. The Royal Manual. So erosion, the manual. Section 8J, the manual. Rockiness, the manual. So we point to the manual, and you go to the manual, and these are actually really short sections, and they're pretty much basically a table that explains the different classes that are recognized. And so the thought here was that, there's not too much, and that we should incorporate that potentially into chapter 17 so that it's all in one place, as opposed to having people have to chase down the manual. And the manual is not very obvious to find either. So at the very least, I would say that we would want a hyperlink to that report if we're not going to update information so that people can get to the manual and see what all of these things are. Oh, you're seeing my emails now. So discussion on this item. So should we expand on chapter 17 to include some of these in-field soil descriptors, acknowledging that these would come from the national system and that there are probably some provincial subtle differences in field manuals and how things are described? Brandon.
Are we allowed to put stuff from the manual into this thing?
I don't see why not.
like copyright issues and all that sort of business?
I mean, we can put it in and we can still reference it, say that it comes from day 1983. We wouldn't be like, we're not infringing on copyright. We would still acknowledge the original document.
All right.
Makes sense.
It's just like you go back to the original day 1983 document and it's all about how you enter information on punch cards. I mean, it's so outdated. It's absurd. And it's in a type font set that's, you know, half of it you can't read. Anyways, I just I don't like it. Graham, I thought, yeah,
I was just thinking that's because you're a hell of a lot younger than me. I live with it.
Richard.
As an extension to this, you're talking about referring to day for descriptive criteria. We've also got other analytical chemical data criteria in there as well. Cation exchange capacity, blah, blah, such. These things have to be referred to some kind of a standard method, because as we well know, you're measuring cation exchange capacity. There's different ways of doing it, and they can give quite different values. That's just an example I'm throwing out there, but I think that's along the same lines. There's got to be tightening up of all of the references to criteria that we're using.
Yeah, I believe, I might be wrong, but I believe the majority of the lab methods that are referenced in the Canadian System of Soil Classification all reference McCaig. But yes, it should be explicitly stated in wherever the references are brought up. There should be a reference to the specific method so that everybody's on the same page. Graham.
Listening to that, should perhaps all methods referenced move to the new version of ARTO? I forgot the soil methods manual. Jim might remember the name of it. I think that's been updated as well, because a lot of the references to methods go back a very long way, and people think if it hasn't happened in the last 10 years, it's not real. But manuals have been updated, or chemical manuals have been updated. So as another tedious task, maybe updating all those through the entire classification book would be an idea.
Carter and Gregorich.
Carter and Gregorich, yep.
Yeah. Because that should be the state of the art of how things are happening.
All right, so I'm not hearing any pushback to potentially including, at least for the sections that are referenced, the material directly in the book. And I'm also hearing an additional item here that we should go ahead and do updating or making sure that we're referencing up-to-date references. So let me I'll give this one a different color. All right. Jim has proposed that we move all of the soil profile images into their respective chapters, as opposed to putting them as a big block of pictures up at the front of the book. Now, I think that probably it was done that way because of printing limitations when they first did the design of the Canadian System of Soil Classification, which would have been, that book would have started in '78. And so any discussion on this, or any objections to moving the example profiles to their respective chapters? This is going very well. So this one's a bit different. So diagrams should be expanded to include all subgroups, not just some subgroups. The addition of color would also be useful. So we had a session a couple meetings ago where we discussed artwork specifically. This one is probably something that we have to maybe park for right now, because there was some discussion about potentially removing those diagrams from the starts of the chapter and just using images instead. And so, yes, so Jim's got all the, so these are all the pages for the starting of every one of the soil orders. Is that right, Jim?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I wrote that, so.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna park that one as a discussion to be had when we revisit the artwork. So I think we were supposed to, I'll loop back in, be getting some example artwork with color, without color of some of the diagrams in the book, plus some of the soil profile ones. And then we are also going to compile some images with the help of Dan Pennick to see if we can't use images to replace some of these things. And so I think we'll leave this one for further discussion at a later date when we start talking about stuff. Page 150, we should make clear that stoniness refers to surface stoniness to be differentiated from the abundance of stones found in individual soil horizons. And so page 150, Jim. Stoniness classes right here. Yes, the land surface occupied by fragments. So I have no issues with referring, I usually refer to this as surface stoniness, but any objections to adding that qualifier, surface stoniness? I see none.
Very logical. Can't have logic.
Okay, oh, Jim, this one's more complicated. So EB, other glaciolic soils or an AP horizon. So let's go to page 35, key to the great groups. All right, other glacial soils that have either an AH horizon greater than 10 centimeters in thickness or an AP greater than 15 in thickness and have at least 2% organic carbon in the surface horizon makes it a humic glacial. All right, so based on this, it is possible to create a humic glacial from an orthic glacial with one or more cultivation passes. Yes. Jim, do you have some clarification?
Yeah, I guess it's more of a question is the like that it's a question observation. In other words, this is what we can see. It's happened that we have two series exactly as referenced there. And that's exactly, we see them in the field all the time. And it originally mapped as either a Cheney or a Vaudreuil. And now, since they're now either tile drained and or cultivated, you can't tell the difference. And they're all technically, as we see them in the field, they're now all Cheney or orthohumic glycols. So the question becomes, okay, there's something we can do to remedy that? So I don't really have a solution to the problem. It's just identifying the problem.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, and I think this is persistent through many different subgroups in the Canadian system. We have this issue with alluviated brunosols becoming melanic brunosols, or sorry, Utric, alluviated Utric becoming melanic brunosols because the A becomes thicker with tillage. Yeah, we have brunosols becoming regasols because of tillage, and then you've basically got an AP over a C all of a sudden. So yeah, I see this kind of throughout the system. I'm not sure how we would deal with this. I think we've had some back and forth discussions on whether we're going to have anthric or some sort of modifiers that we could put onto some of these soils. But then again, when something is tilled, it's hard to go back and decide what was it before it was tilled, because there's no way of observing that, right? It's what's being observed at the time of the soil inspection. So okay, we'll leave that one for now. I think it's a good observation, and I think we've had similar discussions a couple of times at some of these meetings, and I'm not sure that there's an easy solution to tillage in general, because this is really a tillage problem. Tillage is changing taxonomy. Colin's got a couple of lengthy ones in here, and I see Colin's joined us. So Chapter 17, which is the descriptions. Again, I see a broad issue facing soil scientists. The private sector is how classification knowledge is integrated, interpreted, or utilized by colleagues in related disciplines, namely geotech, geology, hydrogeology. We have much esoteric nomenclature that gets largely ignored by people in these fields. Loam doesn't even register with the unified soil classification system. Yes. Likewise, the concept of soil drainage class is related to soil texture, water holding, infiltration, but generally misunderstood or misrepresented by users in other fields. Okay, important to align our nomenclature of these and other related disciplines to improve consistency, communications, and uptake. Colin, are you here?
Yeah,
there you are. There you are.
Yeah, and yeah, I didn't mean to just kind of throw that out there and then just leave it alone. But yeah, I just find over my career, like I've worked closely with geotechnical engineers and hydrogeologists in particular, and you know, there's in situations where like there might be regional level soil data that does get used and interpreted. I had the one situation where somebody with 30 plus years of experience in hydrogeology kind of, you know, make some false assumptions about what imperfectly drained or moderately well drained soil meant, and what it can tell you. So like that just kind of made me think, you know, there must be some way to either like do some kind of side-by-side concordance tables of like what, you know, what soil drainage might mean for example, like how it does and does not relate to concepts of hydraulic conductivity or infiltration rate, or and even like in the textural, like soil texture, you know, what is the concordance between, you know, the soil textural classes versus, you know, how the United classification system might describe something in sort of like a side by side. I know that there was, what is it? Was it? I have a field guide book somewhere that did a really good job of doing some of those comparisons. The Kent Watson book, if I recall correctly, had some good discussion about those similarities and differences. So I thought that might be something to consider, or even like a graphic of, you know, if you look at like a hydrogeological system in cross section, kind of what part of the of it are we looking at soils, like the top 1 or 2 meters, you know, where there might be discharge, groundwater discharge for such as permanent or seasonal seeps and springs, you know, what kinds of things will indicate those, like modeling and, you know, that sort of thing. So that's the nature of the comment. And I don't know, I thought maybe with this update and having more more opportunity for providing graphics and illustrations, maybe that's something that can be addressed.
Yeah, so like right now in the book, the only real correlation is the correlation to other taxonomic systems, which is a section that needs to be redone. But you're thinking a little bit more granularity into some of the other descriptors that we use and how that correlates with other disciplines to make our manual a little bit more easy to digest for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't see any issues adding some of that functionality. Richard, in the Ontario manual that you maintain, do we have any of those type of graphics in there? I don't know our field manual well enough to know if there are these correlation tables in there.
Between
Different
correlation tables between,
like between different, for example, soil texture classes, the classification systems.
no.
So unified, USDA, CSSC, those kind of things. Okay.
Here's I'm not sure if you can see that. This is Kent Watson's book, The Soils Illustrated.
Yeah, which page is that?
And that would be sorry. This would be section 6, page 2-24.
We were always battling this two-sided arguments of what is minimally necessary to include in the manual versus what is something that is interesting information but is not regularly used, so it shouldn't be in there.
Yeah, it's fair. I mean, I guess the comment was just in my career, kind of like, especially dealing with hydrogeologists and geological or geotechnical engineers, there's a communicating and kind of understanding the relevance of some of these things that we collect as soil scientists to their work. I mean, there is connectivity, but it's always been sort of a struggle to kind of translate things that are similar but not exactly the same in terms of concepts of texture and infiltration, that sort of thing. So I found that there was often kind of duplication of effort or kind of useful information that the soil scientist pedologist produces that just kind of gets ignored or discarded by or misinterpreted by another discipline.
All right.
I agree, and it's worse when even within the pedology realm, we don't have agreement on the definition of certain terms.
Yeah.
Chapter 16 in the Orange Book talks about correlation of soil taxonomy with other systems. I suppose if we're going to add some text regarding correlation with, say, as Colin refers to as like engineering terms, for example, that chapter might suffice as a sort of a starting point as to where stuff might be inserted. Just a suggestion.
Sure. Colin,
Mm-hmm.
you want some work to do?
Sure. I don't mind. If I'm gonna put up, I better follow through, I guess.
Would you be able to generate like a list of what you think of which one would be the key ones that you would see that would answer the needs of kind of the challenges that you've seen?
Yeah.
And we can circle back to that. I'm not telling you like don't go and build these tables or anything. I'm just saying, could you just ponder the ones that the descriptors that you think would be the most useful to include correlations with other systems and which systems those would be, and then we can maybe have a longer discussion about which ones we think we should include maybe in the manual or not.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Because the other thought as well, folks, is do we need to? So I know we've got the Watson manual, we've got the manual that came out of the University of Saskatchewan with Dan Pennick and group that did, the describing soils in Western Canada, and then we have the describing soils substrates in Ontario, for example. Is there a need to revisit this Day manual from 1982? Everybody seems to have kind of taken that and modified it slightly to meet their provincial needs. Is there maybe a discussion needs to be had about, do we need a national description, a national system for doing descriptions, and we put out a revised version of this Day book as well in the future, that can be used across the country? And I know we've had this discussion before, but it's coming back up. Richard?
If we have a single national system of soil classification taxonomy, that's what we're looking at. We should have a unified framework, consistent framework for definition and interpretation of concepts. And so, there's just too many things going around these days. I'm not saying that anyone is better than the other. All I'm just saying is that if everyone just assumes that all are equal, that's a problem to start with there.
Yeah, as a foreigner, I would suggest you should have a national manual. I can get away with saying that.
most other well-established systems do have an accompanying document for describing soils in the field, and it goes along with the taxonomic document as well. And so I also think that it makes sense that we do something like that. So, but that would be that'd be another project all into itself, and I'll look for volunteers who want to take the lead on doing that.
Well, and that the Canadian one that does exist, what was it in 1987?
Yeah,
Is that the one? Yeah.
Day, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've done this one. So Colin's going to get us a list of what he sees. Colin, this is again coming to you now. Yeah, so this is referencing the grassland works from Sanborn 2010. Melanic brunosols, yes. Sorry, I'm going through this right now.
Yeah, it's okay. So this is an issue that's come up because of ongoing soil inventory work and environmental assessment work in the Elk Valley in particular, where there's high elevation grasslands, and there's a number of factors that are affecting the fact that these grasslands exist there, and by really all definitions of Chernozemic soils, these soils would fit. However, there is work ongoing, I believe, to suggest that there could be some like coal dust or coal particles that have been integrated into the topsoil, which is affecting the CDN ratio, and so and the base saturation. So they don't necessarily meet the literal definition of a Chernozemic A. However, they are naturally occurring grasslands, and by every other criteria, they would be considered a grassland. And this has implications potentially for conservation. And the Ktunaxa First Nation are quite adamant that these high elevation grasslands are critically important for traditional land use, and that they are irreplaceable. And so but there's a reluctance by industry to kind of call them Chernozems because of what that might mean for the protection of native grasslands. So some politics.
Yeah,
in
so
soil
that's
classification.
yeah, so that's interesting. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, so the I guess Paul's paper shows soils that do meet all the criteria for Chernozems, but that occur in the high interior mountains. And I would say we have some similar grassland soils in Ontario that we think meet most of, if not all of the criteria for Chernozemic soils, but are excluded from the group based on climate. And so like to start to say that you're lucky that Constantine's not on the call today, because he's very passionate about his Chernozems, as we know. Yeah, I'm not sure where to go with this one, to be honest with you, Colin. I'd invite people with more experience with the grassland soils. I guess I would ask first, maybe, so if it doesn't meet all the requirements of Chernozemic A horizon, so it's not a Chernozem, Colin, like if it's called a Melanic brunosol, what's the difference between something being called a Chernozem or a brunosol in that particular landscape with regards to importance or protections? Like if it's a grassland environment, does it matter if it's a Chernozem or a brunosol?
Well, I think it's because the central concept of the Chernozem is natural grassland, and Melanic brunosols are forest soils.
Yeah, the Chernozemic concept there has to be associated with the grassland feature, which involve a few things. One is the freezing and thawing cycle. Another is really the kind of enrichment of calcium and the humus formation, and that kind of feature there. So I think that may be why we kind of try to put some climate bound there to avoid other features.
Yeah, I think the main message here is that, I mean, I don't expect it necessarily to get decided and resolved on this call, but I think it is something that it's one of these issues that as I've kind of picked Paul Sanborn's brain about this over the last couple of years, you know, he's kind of revealed that there's been that this topic comes up, you know, every once in a while, and that, you know, there is good reason to, you know, kind of clarify this particular instance because of one, how extensive these areas are in that part of southern British Columbia, and also that there is this kind of ambiguity in the classification system when it comes to natural grasslands in alpine areas. I'll just leave it at that for now. Duke it out with Constantine some other time.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so this is one of those ones that I was pointing to that is what is going to take more work. Is not something, yeah, that we can't, it's not something we can conclusively resolve today, but yes, thank you for the suggestion. I think that goes along well with, I think, the work that Sanborn has done and the work that we've done some sampling, but we haven't done some lab work yet, but for you know, looking at soils that meet the Trinidemic requirements as well here in Ontario. So Richard, I'm going to put you on the spot here. So Richard is wondering why we don't use an E horizon for alluvial horizons in Canada, and why we use the small e tagged onto an A horizon, an AE horizon. So taxonomy, WRB, Brazilian system and New Zealand system all use capital E's for describing horizons. The Australian system still uses a small e for conspicuously bleached horizons. E is used to designate a certain level of decomposition in organic soils for those other systems for a small e. So Richard.
I just want to make one quick reference to the previous one.
Oh yeah, sure.
Because, and in our circumstances, this notion of linking it to some historical ecosystem type, biogeoclimatic region, grassland, it's on one hand, we're developing a soil taxonomic system, not a ecological classification system. And the other thing is the soils are not just a function of necessarily the climate from the standpoint of rainfall and temperature that might be measured over the past 30 years. But we can't ignore the fact that in some circumstances you have sandy soils whose ecological expression is much more arid than the surrounding soils. And so this notion that we've encapsulated our vision of the Trinidemic soils have to be some grassland in some moisture regime. I think we have to revisit that. It's too narrow, and the other thing that we're kidding ourselves, because we're tilling these soils, and we've been tilling for 150 years, putting all kinds of grass crops on, forb crops on, and you take a soil in one part of the country and look at it, and you compare the so-called AP horizons, and you wonder, well, what is fundamentally the difference here? Just because this area is getting more rainfall now than the other area? We're classifying the soil. I think we've got to keep going back to that idea. Yeah, the E horizon, I don't know. I've always wondered this ever since I've learned other systems, why we're continuing to use this small case E rather than just going along with the uppercase E. If you want to talk about, well, what about the AHE horizon? Well, what does that mean? That means you've got a horizon that's got an expression of some kind of alluviation still there. And it's, well, we've got the capacity to call it uppercase AE, just like we've got a AB, BA, BC, CB. That doesn't preclude that possibility. But what it does do, if we were to adopt the uppercase E, is free up that lowercase e. And I've got thoughts on where we could go with that. There's a lot of possibility there, if you want to hear that.
So I'm wondering, thinking out loud, I'm wondering, is this type of a proposal bigger than just an informal discussion amongst the group and a decision, or is this something that we would, is this something that we would do kind of like we did with the special issue, where we would suggest, you know, we need to work on, you know, on a paper that describes the rationale and describes, you know, these other systems and how it's being used and how this modification would fit into our taxonomic system, or do we feel that this is something that can just be done informally and not through, you know, a more like a publication type approach? Chi, please.
I kind of get a mixed feeling with this one there. I do know that, you know, what Richard is saying there, that capsule letter you can use elsewhere in other systems. The thing we have here in Canada is the capital letter A representing the topsoil, basically. Then there's all kind of topsoil, therefore the small letter E is just one type of definition there for kind of topsoil there. You know, if you go with the US approach for the molic soil, molic epipedon approach, then there's some issues propagated without ability to thermodynamic soil and many other kind of soil as well, if they meet the epipedal horizon designation there. One thing here in Alberta is we do not have land reclamation and conservation things, and we ask people to, you know, conserve topsoil. From a reclamation and you know, ecosystem reconstruction perspective, the AE horizon, AHE horizon, or even the, what we may call that a capsule layer E horizon, they are so much enriched with the plant propagules and seeds, and they are really, you know, from agriculture, maybe you don't like them, but for forestry, that is really important. It's a pot of gold for reclamation, for revegetation, especially for native vegetation. So I think, you know, I just want to throw that there. So see how we could look at addressing issues in this kind of field.
Go ahead, Richard.
So, I mean, from the very fundamental, A horizon is one that we normally characterize as a horizon of surface enrichment.
Yeah.
Whereas the E horizon, it's very clearly designated as a horizon which is a zone of loss of material. Right. So the two concepts are at extreme ends. I don't think this is at all getting into the realm of creating a molic epipedon. That's not at all where I'm visualizing this going. It's simply saying from, let's just call what we've been calling AEs E, and free up the E, small case E, for something that I think has much more useful potential. I honestly don't know how, to what extent this would require a very comprehensive paper written up on, Dan. I don't know. That's just my opinion.
Yes, yeah, no, I agree, Richard. That's why I put the question out there, because I don't necessarily think either that this is the type of proposed change that needs some sort of publication to accompany it. I would certainly welcome if we, if you wanted to, and you know, I would help you with that. We could maybe put together just a short document that outlines the proposal and what those impacts would be on the system. It wouldn't be an exhaustive report. I mean, something fairly short and concise, with some arguments for and just kind of leave it at that, and then we can revisit that, so we can circulate that and then revisit. I certainly don't see this as being, you know, a huge fundamental change in the system to change the horizon designation. And I agree with you that the A versus the E horizon they are fundamentally different in what's happening in those types of horizons.
Just as a trailer in terms of where we could go with the letters, AEI, just as they're being used in the US to designate degree of decomposition of the organic matter. And we've got that handled quite nicely with FMH here. But in our system right now, we have a J, which tells us that we haven't passed the minimum threshold for a given property. And it's applied be TJ, GJ, a variety of things. We don't have a framework that allows us to have the ability to express somewhere along a gradient. So whether it's the gradient of accumulation of organic matter in a mineral horizon or any other feature, using the AEI in the mineral soils could potentially be an option to be able to distinguish, for example, the A horizon of a brown chernozem, the A horizon of a dark brown chernozem, the A horizon of a black chernozem, or where we're looking at scenarios where we've got A horizons that are the consequence of prolonged tillage combined with erosion, where we've got an AP horizon that's just from A horizon, we've got an AP horizon that might be a combination getting down into B, and we've got an A horizon which might actually be incorporating C. We could potentially visualize using those A, E, I along that gradient. That's just an initial thought on where we could go with that.
All right, moving along. We're maybe not going to even get to the end of this list today. So one of them was the renaming of the organic soils. Let's see, Richard is smirking. So yes, the soil taxonomy in WRB used the word histosol. So why organosol? Question was for you, Richard. The Brazilian system uses organosolo. Australian system uses organosol.
I don't know. I've always just found this particular name strange because everything else has sol added on behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And we just call it an organic soil.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we just call it an organosol or something like that? What's the holdup? Why do we have to say organic soil? We've got podzol, we've got brunosol, we've got luvasol.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just being provocative here.
So then would we then refer to it as the organosolic order?
You'd have to be consistent with the others because you talk about luvasolic, podzolic, brunosolic. Yes.
Yeah. Organosolic.
But then we can refer to as organosols rather than organic soils. Well, that's one word. I'm not going to die on this hill.
Yes, I know. So I'm gonna skip past the Len Lescu section. These are changes. Len went through and put all this detail in, which is greatly appreciated. But a lot of this are the changes that are also listed in part of the proposal for the anthroposolic order. And so these are already covered in that proposal. And so I think we can skip over this one, but this makes our job of incorporating into the different chapters a lot easier because it's all listed right there. This one I think we can just say is good to go. So the orthic subgroups of the brown, dark brown, and black chernozems have listed the BT horizon as being a possible horizon within the profile. So I won't go to the pages, but essentially where the horizons are underlined, the diagnostic horizons, or actually it's not diagnostic, but it's put in there as an option. A BT horizon is possible for these soils, which it's not, because that would make it alluviasol. And so I think that's an easy correction. We can I'm not sure how we'll deal with it. Either just remove it or put a J beside it. End of story. Oh, same proposal. Look at that. We've already dealt with this one using an E instead of a small e. So Jim and and Richard are splitting and attacking from two sides on this one. Okay, so this one I think is also going to be something that's a bit more of a lengthy discussion, and we've alluded to this, and we've had a little bit of discussion about this in the past. And I've tried to do some digging to get to kind of the bottom of this, but it's a bottomless pit. So we went away from using using things like GLADE as qualifying terms or modifiers at the subgroup level, if you will, to efficiently recognizing all of these things at the subgroup level. And so the question becomes, we're adding leptic, for example, with there's GLADE, and there's some other ones that are pretty much universal. I'll call them universal subgroups. And so the question becomes, do we want to change back to using qualifying terms? So essentially the key to our Canadian system of soil classification becomes truncated, and then you just allow for these modifying processes or features. If they're described, then you would tag on these additional modifiers. And so you could classify an orthic melanic brunisol, and if it has distinct models above 50, well, you would say, well, that's a GLADE version of that thing. And so in the key and then in the chapters, instead of repeating the definition essentially of an orthic melanic brunisol and then saying it also has distinct models, we just say it differs from the orthic by having this feature. Now that goes a little bit against how you would organize all of these, organize the subgroups in sequence. So the previous comment about reorganizing things in the same order as the key, because in a lot of them, the orthic comes out as the last, right? And so, but then you'd want orthic to be the main definition. So it changes things in terms of how we can reorganize, or if we do a reorganizing. But I guess the first question is, does anybody, and I doubt it, recall the rationale for the change of going away from using these qualifying terms at the subgroup level and then actually, hardening them as subgroups? Does anyone, I'm looking at Paul Sanborn potentially, and maybe Graham, recalling those changes in the late 70s, because that was a change when we went, I think, from the 74 to the 78 version, if I recall. So hearing none. Okay. Are there concerns about changing the way that we treat the subgroups in the system, where we don't necessarily explicitly define every single subgroup, but we truncate these things to make the manual a little bit smaller, and we essentially say a GLADE melanic brunisol meets the criteria of the melanic brunisol plus has this feature? Chi?
I think the order of those keys there provide a mechanism to resolve competing features. Sometimes you may have two, subgroup feature there, then that order of the key give a way of, in this case, how one feature override another in classification.
Right. I think that's a good point. That's a good point. And I think, to be honest with you, I mean, for the first probably few years that I was doing soil survey, I didn't really realize that there was a key that ordered things. So I think a lot of people maybe don't necessarily catch that section of the taxonomic system as well. So that would put maybe a little bit more emphasis on using the key as well. Richard?
If our definition of what GLADE means and leptic means is invariant with respect to any higher level of the taxonomic system, we've always got, at least from the perspective of the GLADE, it always is an option that comes out before the unGLADE variant. And it always puts the GLADE at the start. So it really is just collapsing down the key, going through those other things first. And once you've decided, then you've got a supplementary question. Do you have the criteria for it being leptic? Do you have the criteria for it being GLADE? If it is, tack it on the front. And ultimately, it doesn't change the term, because in the end, it's going to be a glade, blah, 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 whatever. It's just how it's handled from the standpoint of the key, and the fact that you don't have to have a formal definition of it back where you formally define every one of the subgroups.
All right, thanks, Richard. So, cognizant of time, we didn't get through our list, but we did pretty good. And we have some green in there, so that's positive. So I think so in 2 weeks there's the CSSS. There will be a pedology committee meeting. We will not be doing something specific to this working group, or the soil what we're calling the soil classification working group. I will probably what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend the meetings, probably going to the end of the calendar year, and I will put in some info in terms of what the topics are going to be at the upcoming meetings, and we'll go from there. So I'd like to loop back and revisit some of the or all of the topics that we've covered in more detail, and kind of see where we're at. Been doing some work and consolidating kind of comments and coming up with potential compromises, and it would be really nice if we can get to a point starting in July, to start I guess coming up with a consensus revisions. We do need to move this along. Potentially some of the issues that are a little bit larger, I think that we can maybe say maybe we need to start thinking about what we include in the 4th edition and what we don't include in the 4th edition, and we say we'll put that into the next version that comes after the 4th edition. Remember that we're going to a digital format, so that we can make changes a lot easier in the future. We're not limited to print versions, and so I think that we have some flexibility in terms of putting in some changes and then continuing to work on some of these other bigger issues and making those changes. But certainly I would like to at the very least deal with the the 10, I guess, major topics that were proposed in through the special issue, and at least get those moving through and into that 4th edition, and then potentially some of these other issues, some of the ones that have been listed on the list that we've talked about today, I see as being potentially things that need to get pushed to the 5th, because I think that we could spend probably the next number of years talking about what we would like to see, but if we don't actually put pen to paper and or whatever keystrokes to paper, we're not going to get there. So Paul, comment.
Yes, I agree with your general approach here. I mean, we could discuss some of these things till doomsday, and I think it would, in a sense, it would kind of shortchange the effort, the substantial effort that has already been devoted to this task. And, as one of the contributing authors, I kind of like to see some payoff to the overall goal of this, and in the form of version 4. And plus I'm an old guy and I'd like to see this get out before I croak.
Hey, you're a young fella, Jim. Come on. Sorry, Paul. It's all relative.
All right, so I'll send out some details, but essentially I think that'll be the focus for kind of July, August, September. The next few meetings is really to focus on those initial papers that were submitted in the special issue, and get some agreement on what we'd like to see in the 4th edition, and put that material together. We do have a digital copy of the 3rd edition, which we can start we'll start editing and putting content into, using track changes, and happy to share that with everyone as we're kind of going along, so people can have a look at that. We also have colleagues in Quebec who have agreed to do the revisions on the French version of the manual, and so I'm hoping that, I think when they did the 3rd edition, there was maybe a 3-year gap in between the release of the English and French version. I'm hoping that we can tighten that up considerably and release both fairly close to one another. And so, yeah, so look for some more emails, and we will keep pushing this along as much as we can, with hopes that by late 2024. That really is our target, to make sure that this work all gets out. And based on the funding, Brandon, that we got for editing services and artwork support, I think that's got to be also used up by by the end of 2024. Is that correct?
A little bit before that.
A little
Maybe
bit
the
before
summer.
the summer. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's really that's another thing that's kind of guiding this timeline, is that we do have some funding, and we don't want to let that funding lapse. We want to make sure that we benefit from that as much as possible. So, all right, thanks everyone. And for those going to the CSSS, enjoy the meetings, and I will see you all again in July.